Well, we don't have our very exciting music like we do on our podcasts. I think we're just about ready to go. Lucie?
Yeah, I'm ready when you are.
Welcome, everybody. So welcome to the Oxford Human Rights Festival. I'm Victoria Greenwood.
And I'm Lucie Dick.
The festival theme for 2021 is disruption, which could not be more pertinent in these pandemic times. As we try to make sense of what is going on in the world around us, the We Need You podcast series will investigate, with a special guest, how misinformation and disinformation is fed through our media and social media, and question who is in control of our daily diet of propaganda.
In this final episode on the We Need You podcast, we ask our very special guest, Dr. Richard Carver, to help us understand more about freedom of speech and its power to protect, disrupt, but also silence. We will ask about misinformation, media, and political narratives, and what happens when they collide with freedom of expression and protest.
Richard is an expert in his field. He's worked for many human rights organisations, including Amnesty International and Article 19. He's published many works on freedom of expression, media law, and defamation. He's co-editor of the Journal of Human Rights Practice, reader in human rights and governance at CENDEP, Oxford Brookes, and teaches international human rights law with Arba Minch University in Ethiopia. Richard, a huge welcome to the We Need You podcast. We're thrilled to have you here, and thank you for joining us today from your home in Washington, DC.
Victoria, Lucie, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So let's get started. In a world, is a world possible where all people everywhere can freely express themselves and actively engage in public life without fear of discrimination?
Well, we're a long way from there. I'm not a utopian in my human rights work. There's a rather famous recent book about human rights called The Last Utopia, and I think maybe many of my colleagues think about it that way, but I don't. I have a rather more sort of small c conservative view of human rights. I think that they are basically about protecting people's right to to express themselves, to organize themselves in their interest, to fight against discrimination, to fight against economic oppression and various other things. But I don't think they constitute a sort of total program for the transformation of human society. They simply provide the tools for people to sort of participate fairly. But I mean, as we know, and really the whole purpose of this discussion is that we know that we are quite a long way from that situation right now.
We're in quite a state of heightened polarization, I'd say.
Yes, I mean, it's the big development. I mean, we see it very acutely in the past 4 or 5 years because of various political developments. But I think it goes back a bit further than that. The lack of shared sources of information, shared trusted sources of information, which goes back, well, at the very least, it goes back, I would say, to the advent of 24-hour cable news. Just at the moment when news organizations were cutting back on their budgets for, old-fashioned things like reporters who actually used to gather facts and talk about them. And so you have, I mean, we talk about people being in their own online information bubbles, but I think those information bubbles have been developing for 30 years or so.
I think we probably all know that we do disagree, and it's okay to disagree. But what about once society stops believing in its sort of shared basic realities? Does that put democracy itself at risk?
Well, I think what we've seen in the past few years, and I think, and probably the reason really why we're talking about this today, is that this lack of shared reality has been weaponized by various authoritarian or would-be authoritarian regimes. So we see a trend across the world in a lot of countries which are maybe not very similar to each other in other ways, but I'm thinking of places like India, Brazil, Turkey, Russia, Hungary, and certainly the United States, where I live, and to an increasing extent the UK, where I come from and where I work, that control of information and outright lying, outright untruths become part of the tactics of government and control, and that becomes extremely dangerous. And what it harks back to, and I don't want to be overblown about this, but what it harks back to is the totalitarian societies of the 1930s and 40s, where we really, and that's where we really have our understanding of propaganda from, that the big lie, it wasn't just that it was untrue, it was that there was never any real pretense that these things were true. And the fact that Hannah Arendt wrote about this, that the fact that the dictator may say something completely different tomorrow from what they said today is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, because people will go along with that because the dictator controls the narrative. Now, we're not talking about dictators in the case of the UK and the US, although we are in some of the other countries I mentioned. But that control over what is to be believed becomes very dangerous. And you combine that with the information bubbles, and you realize that some people are simply never getting information to challenge the reality that the person that they support, or their way of thinking. They simply don't have that. And that's what has changed in our societies in recent years.
So within that, what about the role of leaders and regards to misinformation? For example, the UK Prime Minister misled Parliament 15 times with incorrect statements just in his first year as PM. This goes against many ministerial codes of conduct and is a resigning offence. Do we now accept misinformation as normal?
Well, I mean, one reaction to that is people get very sort of worldly and cynical and say, oh, well, we know all politicians lie, and it's just, there's nothing very unusual about that. But I don't think that's quite true. I mean, I think that, the likes of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and Putin in Russia and Erdogan in Turkey, they are something different from, simply, it's not the same as, we used to look at the spin unit in Downing Street when Blair was Prime Minister. This is something qualitatively different from that. So it's not normal and it's not acceptable. How do we address it? Well, I think there's sort of two ways of addressing it. One is the role of the media in calling out lies, and I mean, here in the United States, the media were very caught off balance by Donald Trump. I mean, he is not a normal politician. He behaves in these kind of outrageous ways and talks complete nonsense a large part of the time. And they didn't really know how to report this. Well, actually, to start with, there's a quotation from, I think it's somebody in one of the cable networks saying, one of the sort of more liberal cable networks saying, well, we don't like Donald Trump, but he's actually very good for us because, he means viewing figures. And so that was how it started out. And I think there was a belief that if you just let the man go on television, and he's this kind of ludicrous figure, talking, palpable nonsense and not really able to even to string sentences together, and then people will be put off him. But of course, that didn't work at all. And so you had to have, there was an evolution. There was a lot of fact checking. So when Trump says something, then you check it. Is that true? Is it not true? And that, I think, is also being done now with Boris Johnson. And the other thing is to be very careful about how you manage their appearances on television. Mm-hmm. And what happened to start with Trump was that they tended to kind of clean him up, as it were. So he's edited in a way where he seems to make more sense than he actually does if you watch him live. And so, there was a kind of understanding that actually sometimes you just need to present him straight. But of course, eventually, well, I think basically they got much more critical over time, not in a partisan way, but in a way of identifying facts. The other way is politics, and that is, they have to be held accountable through the political process. So that's through Parliament with Boris Johnson. It was through impeachment with Trump. But even that impeachment lesson tells us that his party wouldn't abandon him, even when he was grossly in violation of his oath of office.
Okay, that actually partially answers my next question. So not just about lying, but hostile use of language, which is something humanitarian Josie Norton talked about in our second podcast. Barely a week goes by without reference to illegal asylum seekers, which there is actually no such thing in law. How can we keep on top of this political propaganda?
Well, it's there is no simple answer. In fact, maybe there is no answer really at all. I mean, part of it is about reporting, and it is about responsibility of the media. And I mean, Belinda Goldsmith's interview was very interesting because she took a rather old-fashioned view of the role of the journalist, and I don't mean that in any sort of critical way. And I completely share the view that it is the role of the journalist to report facts accurately. Now, I mean, that oversimplifies it, because there's it's obviously about the way in which stories are framed, as well as just the facts that are reported. But I think that it's the media have to challenge this. But it also means that we have to try and create our alternative platforms where alternative voices are heard. I mean, it may be desirable, and I would say, I would even defend in principle the idea that you should close down hateful speech. But I mean, there are all sorts of practical problems associated with that, which make it probably not a very desirable route to go down.
With Belinda, also, she talked about bias in her podcast, and this is a human rights festival, and this, of course, is our bias, but everything can be interpreted differently depending on different country regimes and different beliefs. So can there really be such a thing as universal?
Well, I think we can, I think we can go back to a shared reality. Yes, of course we have biases. I have my views about human rights, which are not going to be shared by some other people. I have my views about politics, which are not going to, it's a healthy society that disagrees on these things. So if we make the premise that everybody has to agree before we can communicate, then we might as well give up. So I think the thing is to be open about what we think, and what direction we're coming at a problem from, and and then be prepared to be challenged on that.
Okay, I'm moving the conversation on to the free speech. Should free speech overrule everything, even when violence is incited, and we can no longer isolate events online from behaviour on the ground?
No, no, absolutely. Free speech doesn't overrule everything else. It's a very important human right. It's an indispensable human right in all sorts of ways, but it's not the only human right. And it's and in the kind of the legal hierarchy of rights, it is not at the top. And that's because it's a right that can be limited. There are various other human rights that may not be limited in legal terms in any circumstances. So the right not to be tortured, the right not to be enslaved, the right to life. These are absolutely fundamental human rights. The right to freedom of expression may be limited in certain circumstances if that's necessary. Now, the one circumstance in which I think everybody would agree that it should be limited is when it incites violence, and there's a reasonable prospect that violence may eventuate because of that. And that's essentially a factual determination that you have to make. I mean, if you want a recent example of it, Donald Trump talking to the crowd on Pennsylvania Avenue and sending them down to the Capitol to stop the registration, the certification of the Electoral College votes. That's an example of incitement to violence. Now, the problem is, and I mean, even those of his own party who voted to acquit him in his impeachment trial basically said there is something for the courts to look at here. The problem is, as soon as we move a little way away from that, because actually the human rights standards go further than that. They say it's not just incitement to violence, it's incitement to discrimination, which is not a very clear concept. What do we mean by incitement to discrimination? I think that means what we might call hate speech. I mean, the sorts of things that Josie Norton was talking about, directed at refugees. That speech may be restricted in order to prevent those things happening. And I have no problem with that in principle. I don't think, sometimes speech is not just expression. Sometimes speech actually constitutes actions which are threatening to people, and that it threatens their human rights, and therefore it should not be allowed. The problem, to me, is not a theoretical one about where do you draw the line, although obviously that's something we can debate. The question that's difficult for me is who draws the line.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to give governments the power to draw lines that restrict speech, because most often they will actually use them to restrict our speech. My speech as a human rights activist, or Josie as a refugee advocate, or Esther as a climate activist and on racial justice issues. These are the people who will actually be affected by this. The example I always use is the example of apartheid South Africa. Now, apartheid South Africa had these impeccable anti-hate speech rules. They said that anybody who incites hatred between racial groups commits a crime. But of course, the people who were prosecuted for this were the anti-apartheid people. They were the anti-racists who were prosecuted, not the defenders of apartheid. So my question is, if we, it's very easy to react. We see something online and we think that shouldn't be allowed. They shouldn't be allowed to say that. It's untrue, it's hateful, it's racist, it's misogynist, whatever it may be. But who is going to make that decision?
Yeah. So is it right that our communication ecosystems are controlled by a small group of executives at social media companies, such as Facebook?
Well, it isn't right. It's difficult to see the alternative. And I'd actually extend the question a little bit and say it's also other media companies. I mean, look, for example, at the influence of Rupert Murdoch's companies across the world, and in every country where he has newspapers or TV channels, and they have a rather kind of baleful influence. The problem with social media companies, with online companies, is that, I mean, the whole world, because of the dominance of the US in the online tech industry, the whole world is essentially governed by something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was a 1990s law in the US, which said it basically was intended to protect. Well, it was intended actually to regulate, but to protect online speech. And it said that tech companies, and here it was mainly because social media didn't exist in those days, so this was mainly talking about internet service providers, that they would be regarded as platforms, not as publishers. And so meaning that it wasn't reasonable to expect that you know, the company that you, well, in those days you dialed up to what was probably your phone company and made an internet connection, and they couldn't be held responsible for what you might then post online. If that what you did was in some way illegal, that was on you, not on the company. And I mean, this has been criticized. I mean, oddly enough, it was actually criticized by Trump, who I think didn't really, as usual, didn't quite understand what he was talking about. I mean, you know, if Twitter had been liable legally for all the things that Trump posted, then he would have been kicked off Twitter a lot earlier. So, you know, the question is, well, how do we tackle this? I mean, some people say, well, you can keep it in private hands, but you can break it up. You need to break up these tech monopolies. But I mean, that's difficult because for some of them, I mean, for Facebook, I mean, the whole point about Facebook is that everybody's on the same network, or everybody in the world apart from me, it appears, but everybody else seems to find this a necessary thing. And the whole point is that you're on the same network as your friends and your family and all the people that you want to connect with. So you can't actually do that. Or, well, what else do we say? The government should take it over? I don't think so. I'd be very nervous about the government controlling social media. So, you know,
it's a very complex area.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer. We are where we are, and I think it's not a very desirable situation. But all the alternatives seem to be worse. I mean, I do think that there are questions to be asked about things like Facebook algorithms and the sort of circulation of damaging material. And these are the types of things that, you know, in whenever it was 1995, the drafters of the Communications Decency Act didn't, you know, I mean, they probably hadn't heard of an algorithm. So so I mean, they could be revisited, but I think the basic structure is rather difficult to deal with.
It certainly feels like we're in the still in the Wild West with social media. So moving towards the pandemic and what's been happening more recently, governments in many countries now have unprecedented powers due to the pandemic. The UN Secretary General recently spoke about, well, lawyers, medics, educators, all being subject to intimidation for criticising government responses. Has the pandemic been used as a pretext to crush dissent, criminalise freedoms and silence reporting?
Well, the answer to that is clearly yes, it has. And we have an example from London in just the last few days of pandemic restrictions being used to limit protest. But I mean, before I go on to that, I would just say something else, which is that some restrictions are legitimate. And I mean, one of the ways that human rights is a useful way of looking at these problems is that human rights deal with all this range of things. They're not just about a narrow sort of spectrum of civil rights issues. So we say there is a right to health. There is an obligation on governments to protect people from pandemics and to take whatever emergency measures may be necessary to protect people. So things like, you know, closing sections of the economy, making people wear masks, making people quarantine in certain circumstances, restricting movement in many circumstances. These are not in themselves illegitimate or disproportionate responses. The problem, it seems to me, and I mean, I get very, very frustrated, and I mean, I may be seeing this a little bit through an American lens, and that's my bias here, is, you know, there are a lot of lunatics in this country who believe that they have a constitutional right not to wear a mask and to potentially infect other people. And we've had, I mean, on one side of the political spectrum, we've had, you know, these various super spreader events because people come along and they sort of they believe it's a hoax, or they believe that it's a Chinese virus, and you know, inconsistent, and it doesn't make sense, but they feel that they're not bound by these things. So I don't kind of excuse or justify any of that. But very often what happens is that these restrictive measures, even if they're acceptable measures, are put in place without the proper protections. They're not enacted into law properly. They're too broad in their scope, and then they are used to restrict other activities, as we saw in London, and we've seen loads of places. I mean, we had a really good piece on the CENDEP blog a few weeks ago about Hungary and how precisely that has happened. We see in Ethiopia. I mean, we have a partnership at CENDEP with a university in Ethiopia, and we see how the elections in Ethiopia were postponed because of the pandemic, which on the face of it doesn't seem like it's too unreasonable. But that's been a contributory factor to the big political crisis and all the violence that has taken place in Ethiopia over the last few months. So these things are very dangerous, and governments that don't feel accountable, to go back to what we were talking about before, will be ready to use these to restrict dissent.
I mean, talking more about the law, I mean, the new policing bill was voted through yesterday in the UK, with some very sort of unusual ways of describing protest, annoying and disruptive being a term, which is interesting because protest, what is protest if it isn't disruptive? What do you think the implications of this for our civil liberties?
Okay, I preface my answer by saying that I haven't read the bill. I've only read media reports of it, and so with due skepticism, given the topic we're talking about, I don't know that I've read completely accurate accounts. I mean, with that proviso, it does seem very worrying. And I mean, not only, I agree with you that protest is inherently disruptive, but it's also it's inherently annoying. I mean, that is the idea that you're not allowed to to irritate people. I mean, we're told about how people on the left are kind of snowflakes and can't take criticism, but I mean, we get annoyed the whole time by the things we come across, and now we're told that being annoying is in some way illegal. I mean, it's nonsensical. And I mean, as I say, I say I haven't read the law, but I mean, with my kind of legal hat on, I kind of think, well, how on earth how is a court going to interpret this? I mean, I suspect not many people are going to be convicted of being annoying, because I think judges are just not going to really accept it. But that's not the danger. The danger is the police shutting down protest because they now have a legal basis to do so.
I think that's true, and also there is the media perspective on it, because it when we spoke with Esther Stanford Jose, our climate activist, she talked about courageous protesters, people who are potentially giving up their freedoms to defend and fight for their causes. But often in the media, you also protesters are referred to as angry mobs. So is demonstration the free speech of the unheard and ignored, or is it angry mobs?
I think, well, I mean, obviously, there are such things as angry mobs, but generally speaking, no. And also generally speaking, I don't think protesters should have to be courageous. I think we should have the right to go out and peacefully protest on the streets, and we might be annoying to some people, and we might be disruptive in that, we've spoiled somebody's, commute home from work or something by blocking the streets. But, that is what being in a democratic society means. That people have the right to do that. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there's a strong element of, this is a platform that, that people otherwise don't have. I mean, the problem with, one of the reasons that social media has proliferated, obviously, is that it offers a platform to individuals who don't otherwise have it. The powerful and the influential have access to the mass media the whole time. Most of us don't. We don't have an opportunity to express our views through the newspapers, through the television channels, or whatever. And and so that's why people go on social media, but it's also why people go out in the streets, because, you know, well, if sort of tens of thousands of us come out and show what we feel about this, then people have to take notice.
Yeah.
And if you're saying that people can't do that, then, I mean, that is it's a form of censorship, if you like. I mean, censorship is normally not used in that context, but that is what it is, because it's saying people can't express their views.
Yeah, to put into some context, if from the bill, attacking a statue, you can get 10 years imprisoned. For rape sentences, they start at 5 years, and there's nothing outlawing street harassment. So obviously it's quite a controversial bill, and it'd be interesting to see how things move forward.
Yeah.
Marina Hyde had a very powerful article actually in the Guardian yesterday about this, and she recounted Jess Phillips MP reading out the names of 118 women who had been murdered in the past year, and of course one additional name, Sarah Everard, is to be added to that since International Women's Day when she did this, and contrasted this with one statue, which was, you know, as it were, murdered. You know, that a 17th century slave trader is tipped off his pedestal into the harbour in Bristol, and everybody gets, you know, everybody thinks that this is an appalling kind of transgression, and some rights somehow are being violated there.
Yeah.
I mean, I simply don't see it.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Richard. And moving on to the topic of free press. We know that 5 billionaires own 80% of the UK press. So it's not exactly free press in charge of the narrative. Yet we have heard challenges to the corporate media machines, calling out bias, elitism, and most recently racism, and last weekend misogyny, has rocketed this establishment. Do you see a sense of change in the air?
I think my honest answer is no, not really. I mean, I think, I mean, you set out the problem correctly. I mean, you know, the media, I mean, the media sort of ecology is different in different countries. And over here in the US, the papers don't count for all that much. I mean, there are some very good ones.
Yeah.
But they don't really set the agenda. That's set by the cable news channels. The UK is different, and the UK is actually very unusual in the extent to which the newspapers, which all but 2 or 3 skew very much to one side of the political spectrum. There is a kind of narrow, you know, I mean, they're owned by billionaires. I guess you have to be a billionaire probably to own a newspaper, unless you have some alternative model like, you know, like the Guardian does. I mean, they determine the agenda, and I mean, I've watched these challenges, because essentially this situation has not changed throughout my adult lifetime. I mean, it really is pretty much as it was when I came of age many years ago, and it has been challenged. It's been seriously challenged on occasions, and probably the most potentially effective challenge was through the Leveson inquiry into the phone tapping scandal. But that, you know, that delivered an awful lot less than we hoped for. So I mean, I think that the press has been fairly effectively skewered by its critics, as you say, in the past couple of weeks, over the racism, over Meghan Markle, and then the misogyny. I don't see things changing. I don't see a kind of avenue for that change to take place.
Okay. This sort of leads us on to the question about balance. Belinda spoke about balance and how you used to have a climate denier in the climate crisis stories. What are your thoughts regarding balance, really?
The problem is that balance becomes a sort of proxy for accuracy. And this comes actually from, it comes originally from sort of the theories behind freedom of expression, which is the idea that if you let people express a lot of different views, then by expressing these, somehow the truth will be arrived at. And that, and this is then visualized as the truth sort of lies somewhere in the middle there. So if you get person expressing one view and person expressing another view, and they debate, then there will be a truth, and it will be somewhere in between those expressions. But of course, there's no reason. I mean, that's a theory. There's no reason to suppose that that is so at all. I mean, and particularly, I don't think it's ever been true, but particularly in the age that we've been talking about, where you have, lying politicians. You have politicians who simply come and say things that are not true. You have the Boris Johnsons and the Donald Trumps and so on. I mean, the truth does not lie halfway between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, because Donald Trump lies almost all the time. It is, and that's, I think, what at least sections of the American media slowly discovered during the Trump presidency. The BBC is the particular offender in this regard, although they would be proud of the fact that they do this. But it's also the mechanism whereby the British printed press is so powerful, because by setting an agenda, that stakes out one side of this balance, and so you then get on somebody else who will state the opposite view. But it creates a tension. It creates a constant attention to an agenda that may be just completely inaccurate and false. Brexit would be a clear case in point, where the Brexit campaign told a lot of lies, but these were not by and large called out as lies. They were simply, they say that we can pay our whatever it was, 365 million on the side of the bus to the NHS. What do you think, Remain campaign? And Remain campaign then has to say, well, actually, no, we don't accept the premise of the question, because the premise of the question is actually based on a falsehood. It's a deliberate lie. And that's the problem. If you frame everything as balanced, and it goes back to what I talked about right at the beginning about the decline in the capacity of the media to report. And I mean, I was talking really about national newspapers and national television networks, but the big thing that we see disappearing in the age of social media, I mean, coincidentally in the age of social media, is local media. And we see it in the UK, and we see it also very strongly in the US. So people who will actually report what's going on locally, and that exists to a much lesser extent than it used to. So instead of reporting being factually based, you have much more of the studio debate with two sides being presented.
This brings us nicely on to a topic I hardly dare ask you, but what are your thoughts on cancel culture, culture wars, and the government's actual intention to appoint a free speech champion? It's interesting as pointing a free speech champion when free speech has just been silenced if you're annoying. But anyway, do answer.
I think cancel culture is a load of absolute nonsense. It is simply not a real thing. I mean, it's the successor of political correctness, which was also not really a real thing. Well, to the extent that it was a real thing, it was kind of a joke. It was, and I remember back in the late 1980s, we might say things like, well, and it was always like this. It was always, what I'm saying is not quite politically correct, but in other words, we knew that political correctness was not a set of rules that we had to follow. So somebody was asking, what is cancel culture? You're lucky not to have come across this. It's the idea that as soon as somebody says something that is offensive, they are denied a platform to express their views. And the reason that I say that cancel culture is nonsense is because the people who are saying this are, by and large, people who have a very good platform. And I'll give you a very current or recent example of cancel culture. Piers Morgan, having expressed his extremely hostile views towards Meghan Markle, was responded to by a co-presenter on his program, who happened to be a man of colour, who rather effectively skewered what Morgan had said. And Morgan got up and walked out of the studio. And he basically said, I don't have to take this. So he then tweeted subsequently with a quotation from Winston Churchill, which I can't remember verbatim, but it was something to the effect of some people's idea of speech is that they can say whatever they want, but nobody's allowed to challenge them, which was an extraordinary lack of self-awareness on his part when he had just done precisely that. So what cancel culture refers to in almost all instances is that basically people are spoken back to, that people who are not used to having their views challenged are challenged. I mean, quite often, not only, but quite often, these are white men who are challenged in racist or sexist or misogynist views. But it isn't just that. I mean, there was a big kind of collective letter was published in one of the American journals and signed by all sorts of people. I mean, including people who I quite admire, but they were all famous writers and people. I mean, it's like nobody is cancelling you. J.K. Rowling, you have a platform. You're the most read author living author in the world. You are not cancelled. It's just that people disagree with you. So I think it's a nonsense. And I think there's talk about, does this happen in universities? Some of the instances that are cited actually are just they're incorrect. I mean, there's a whole story about how Germaine Greer was deplatformed because of her views on transsexuals at I think Bristol University. Well, it turns out it was actually untrue. I mean, there are instances. There have been, for example, instances of anti-Semitic protests on British campuses in recent years, and that's appalling, and it's not acceptable. But this idea that there is a sort of general cancel culture that like, I don't know, that young people are not tolerant of views that are the same as this. It simply, I mean, one shouldn't talk from anecdote, but it certainly doesn't correspond to my own experience of teaching students. And it's well, basically, you have to, if you're claiming there's a cancel culture, you've got to document this. And I just don't see that it's there. It's not tipping Edward Colston into the heart of cancel culture.
Well, we've got one more question before we're going to go to the chat and let our listeners ask some questions. But Lucie and I really wanted to know that we're getting our vaccines. Mine is tomorrow, Lucie's is on Friday, and we're a little bit worried about the Bill Gates microchip being in our doses, and we wondered if you could reassure us.
Well, this is something we haven't talked about, is the proliferation of conspiracy theories online. Yes, the belief that either the vaccine or maybe even the whole pandemic was got up by Bill Gates so that he could inject microchips into us and follow us around and see what we're doing. I mean, okay, Bill Gates owns the largest software company in the world. His software is on our, the mobile devices that we all carry around with us the whole time. Why on earth would he go to the trouble of doing this? It's nonsensical, But at the same time, there are people out there who believe this, and
Yeah.
that's
There really are.
There certainly are. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Richard. And that's mine and Victoria's questions over, but we will go to the questions in the chat. People, you still have time to put questions in the chat if you want to, but I will address the ones that we have had through already. So, Richard, we had a couple from a lady called Becca, and she says, a question for Dr. Richard Carver. You seem to be saying that the structure of journalism has changed. Can I ask how you feel reporting is now influenced by power? I know you have briefly touched on this, Richard, so go in as in depth as you would like.
Yeah, well, we've got about 10 minutes left,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying that there was once upon a time a sort of golden age when journalism was not influenced by power. And I say this as I was a journalist. I mean, after first leaving university, that was the direction I followed for a few years. I think the principal thing that has happened is, as I said, it's the cutting down of investment in the collection of news, which seems like it should be the core of what journalists do. But so much now is it's about discussing the news rather than actually reporting the news. And you see that if you turn on news channels, particularly cable news channels, which are filling the news 24 hours a day. You see it, but you see it in newspapers. Including in the better newspapers. That you have these op-ed columnists, people who are paid to write their opinions every day. And I remembering back, these used to be people, somebody like very distinguished journalist James Cameron, in his retirement, became a columnist for The Guardian. And so he would write based on basically having spent a lifetime as a reporter. What we have now is basically young people with no experience of reporting, or probably many of us no experience of much else, develop a career commenting on things. So it becomes much more of this sort of feedback loop in which instead of putting new information in front of the public, we kind of talk about it.
Okay.
So I think that's the sort of mechanism whereby it's happened. Some journalists are still very critical of power. Some journalists are in the pocket of power, and that was always the case, I think.
Okay. A second question from Becca was, in an age of information overload, how can smaller voices break through the noise? For example, the PlayStation 5 versus humanitarian story mentioned in the Belinda episode.
Well, again, I don't have an easy answer to that. It's encouraging that there are institutions like the Reuters Foundation and the Thomson Reuters Foundation and other similar bodies that, including actually the Gates Foundation, that generate this sort of copy on things like humanitarian, human rights, development issues, the sorts of things that kind of mainstream media organizations are not going to do for the most part on their own. So I think that is one avenue. It's right at the margins. It's not making a big difference, but it's doing something. But I think it's also, I think it is for the organizations working on these issues, and two good examples in your podcast interviews. It's for them also to generate these stories. to work with the media and to use, to use their own online resources to kind of push these things out more broadly. I mean, it will be easier also when we all stop being locked down and go back to some extent, at least, to how things were before, and we will, it'll be much easier to kind of spread ideas about these sorts of issues in more traditional ways. But again, I mean, I'm not offering, I mean, these are just observations. I don't have I don't have an easy answer.
No. Okay, thank you, Richard. Our next question is from Molly. She said, so should users of social media provide identification to verify their media accounts?
It's very tempting, but I think no.
Okay.
I mean, the reason it's tempting is obviously that, people, by and large, people the worst purveyors of abuse online, of the kind of the misogyny and the racism and so on, will be concealing their identities. And there's a sort of sense that, shame would stop them from doing it if their name were known.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not 100% certain that is true. Well, I mean, I'm 100% certain it isn't true in some cases, at least. There are well-known people who seem to have no shame in expressing views under their own name. So, but it might address part of the problem. The reason, however, I would say no, and I would also say that, I mean, I don't really have a presence on social media, but I mean, anything I've ever put online has always been under my own name, because I'm prepared to defend it, and I'm not ashamed of it. So I mean, that would be a rule that I would be happy to live by. But, and the reason I think it's not a good idea, there are many countries where you simply cannot post critical information online under your own name, because you will place yourself at very great risk. And those countries are not even just some of the dictatorships that I referred to earlier on. I mean, even places like the United States, which is, as everybody knows, is a heavily armed society. I mean, there are, some very nasty people with guns out there. I would be very careful about. I mean, I'm a white man. I'm not in the kind of most vulnerable demographic. But I mean, we see the impact of, the way in which online misogyny spills over into sexual assault. I completely understand that I would never say to a woman, you must, oh no, it's only honest to put your name there. No, I don't think so. I mean, people have had to withdraw from social media because of the awful things that have been threatened to them.
Very true. We just had one final question from Emmy, which said, the podcast with Josie Norton talked about how violence against refugees have become normalised. In Greece, children with tear gas and live ammunition is used in the camps. Is that for people that don't want to read this, or is it just not reported anymore?
Well, I think it comes back to the point about, a lot less is reported than used to be reported. And it's also, I mean, this is an awful thing to say, but I mean, some of these things are such regular events that they are seen as not being newsworthy. And I mean, that's terrible, and that's the kind of index of the problem that we have here. But I think what happens is that news organizations may send a reporter now and then to look at a situation, but they are actually not catching all that is going on. And once again, I think it's those of us in human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations like Josie's, I mean, have to. I mean, it's not their responsibility, but they should attempt to draw attention to that. I mean, I'm not cynical about the public and their views of this. I mean, in the US in the last few years, we've lived through the appalling scandal of the child separations at the border. And I mean, these were reported, and probably reported imperfectly, and probably a little bit too late, but they were reported, and people were horrified by and large by this. And there's no doubt that, I mean, long before the pandemic and all the disasters of the past year, the tilt away from Trump and the Republicans, this was one of the factors that was in there. So, there is something to be, when these stories are out there, people are interested, and many people do care. So it is worth it.
Thank you very much. Sorry, technical issue there with me. We have one other question coming in at the moment from Rona. She said, yesterday a bill was passed to make protesting illegal, basically, in a sense. And for some reason, the BBC felt Prince Philip's release from hospital was more newsworthy. Why do you think that was?
Well, it's the royal family is a reliable standby when you want to kind of distract attention. I think look, the BBC is the BBC is a strange phenomenon. There isn't anything quite like it elsewhere in the world. The BBC is always very scared when there's a Conservative government, because they think that the Conservatives are going to cut their license fee. And so, I mean, I qualify what I say by saying that I haven't watched BBC News on a regular basis for the past 10 years. But I mean, even before that, it was a very noticeable phenomenon and it's not, I wouldn't say it's as simple as the BBC is right-wing biased or anything like that. I think the BBC is scared of of what a Conservative government would do to it. And so I think that, deprioritizing an unpopular piece of legislation and pulling the patriotic strings with Prince Philip is a very kind of normal BBC way of responding.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I think we've drawn to the end of our hour. Thank you so much. You've given us so much information and so much insight into free speech, misinformation, disinformation, everything that is going on in the world right now. A lot to cover, and thank you for doing so comprehensively. I've learned loads, and feel that you've answered a lot of our questions. So thank you so much for joining us tonight
and helping us finalise our We Need You podcast.
Yeah, helping us. Lucie and I have gone from scratching our heads in the pub over a glass of wine to sort of asking a lot of questions to actually sort of having a lot of answers now. And we really appreciate your input and being with us tonight. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us as well.
Yeah, and thank you for the questions as well from all the audience tonight. But yeah, thank you. That is us all rolled up. We'll probably just carry on having a bit of a discussion. Any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I think it's all over for us today. So
now.
Thank you. Yeah, we are stopping recording.
Thank you.